Flight attendant tries to remove black woman from the line, then finds out she's the FAA's Chief Regulator. Airports hold promises of new journeys where hopes, anxieties, and human nature all collide under neon-lit corridors. But sometimes, what happens at the gate is more dramatic than the destination itself. In the bustling chaos of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, a single flight attendant's moment of unchecked bias sparks a chain reaction beyond anyone's imagination. A confident black woman, standing patiently in line, becomes the target of misplaced authority and prejudice. Little does this flight attendant know, the woman he's trying to remove is the FAA's newly appointed Chief Regulator, armed with not just a ticket, but the power to change the entire system. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was alive at dawn. Streams of travelers dragged suitcases across polished floors, while overhead announcements echoed through the cavernous terminals. Chatter and laughter mixed with the buzz of anxiety, the ordinary soundtrack of any busy airport, but multiplied here in the world's busiest hub. Dante Ramirez, a flight attendant for Delta Airlines, sipped his extra shot espresso just before reporting for duty. He was lean, with neatly combed hair and a crisp uniform that was pressed to perfection. Despite his outward composure, the lines under his eyes told the story of fatigue. Working multiple cross-country trips in 1 week was taking its toll. He arrived at Gate B27, where an early flight to Denver was already boarding. The digital display behind the gate desk flickered with flight times. Dante flashed his crew ID at the gate agent, a bright-eyed young woman named Addison, and walked onto the jet bridge, stifling a yawn. Passengers were trickling on board, some juggling laptops and pillows, others balancing coffee cups and phone chargers. Dante mentally prepared for the usual routine: greet, stow baggage, ensure compliance with safety procedures, and maybe break up a few petty arguments over overhead bin space. However, just as he was about to step onto the aircraft, a voice crackled through the overhead pass system. "Attention. We are experiencing a slight delay. Please remain calm while we resolve a minor technical issue." The scattered crowd in the boarding area groaned, the universal gesture of travel frustration. Dante glanced back to see if Addison had any news, but she simply shrugged. Great, he thought. Delays often meant tension would spike. He decided to return to the boarding area to keep an eye on passenger morale sometimes. A reassuring presence could quell rising frustrations. In truth, Dante also had a subtle pride in maintaining order. Over his 5 years as a flight attendant, he'd prided himself on being able to read travelers at a glance, pegging who might become problematic later. As soon as he stepped off the jet bridge and into the gate area, he spotted a woman in a tailored navy blue blazer, her posture calm, her expression quietly confident. She had a carry-on suitcase and a sleek tote bag. She radiated a certain self-assuredness that made her stand out in the restless crowd. Normally, Dante wouldn't have given it a second thought. Passengers came in all forms, but something about her presence snagged his attention. Perhaps it was her cool poise amid the swirl of complaints around her, or maybe it was just his own stress, searching for a focal point. He observed as she stepped aside to let a family with small children pass. The father seemed to thank her, and she nodded politely. Then she resumed her place in the line, apparently unruffled by the delay. Dante realized he was staring. He forced himself to look away, blaming the weird tension in the air for his sudden interest. Nonetheless, the moment had planted a seed in his mind. Something about that black woman in the navy blazer felt different. He couldn't quite define it. In a matter of moments, that tiny ripple of curiosity would grow into a wave, one that threatened to upend the carefully maintained order in Gate B27. Little did Dante know that the woman's identity held more weight than than any first impression could reveal. Sophia Alexander had been traveling for work her entire adult life. She started as an aviation compliance officer in her 20s, conducting grueling audits in small regional airports. Over the years, her sharp intellect and composed demeanor earned her a series of promotions. Now, at 45, she was the newly appointed Chief Regulator for the Federal Aviation Administration, a role that put her in charge of overseeing airline safety regulations nationwide. When Sophia received the official notice of her appointment, it had come with a flurry of congratulatory calls, emails, and obligations. Suddenly, her schedule overflowed with invites to speak at conferences, attend policy briefings, and ironically travel even more. This flight to Denver was part of a broader circuit of inspections she was conducting on major airlines. She preferred to do these checks without fanfare, traveling incognito to see the real workings of gate agents, flight attendants, and ground crew. So there she stood in the boarding line at gate 27, quietly observing. She'd arrived early, as was her habit, and had quickly noticed the minor maintenance delay that unsettled the crowd. Families fussed, business travelers sighed, and staff scurried to get answers. Sophia recognized the typical signs: a half-informed gate agent trying to manage updates, the hum of impatience from the line, and an overhead system repeating, "We apologize for the inconvenience." She was used to it all, but it still amazed her how a small glitch could amplify stress levels. Her instincts as a regulator whispered that she should note how the airline handled the situation, but another part of her simply wanted to reach her seat and finish reviewing documents for an upcoming policy review. As she waited, she glanced around. A father with 2 kids was struggling to corral a hyper toddler. Sophia stepped aside to let them pass, remembering how stressful airports could be for parents. She offered a polite smile, and the father nodded in gratitude. Just then, she sensed eyes on her. She discreetly turned her head to see a flight attendant in a neatly pressed uniform Delta's signature navy and red. He was watching her with a gaze that teetered between curiosity and suspicion. For a moment, their eyes met. She offered a small smile, but he looked away abruptly. Sophia tucked the moment into the back of her mind. In her career, she'd encountered all sorts of attitudes, some positive, some tinged with bias. She never jumped to conclusions, but she was always aware of how easily misperceptions could escalate. Today, though, she intended to remain just another traveler. She wasn't wearing anything that identified her as an FAA official. Her badge and credentials were tucked safely in her tote bag. Besides, she wanted to see how people reacted to her without any official rank overshadowing the interaction. Part of her job was to assess intangible factors like courtesy and professionalism under pressure, and going undercover was often the best way to gauge that. She adjusted the strap of her tote bag and turned her attention back to the announcements. A hush fell over the immediate area as another crackling overhead message echoed, "Flight 237 to Denver is delayed due to routine maintenance checks. We will board as soon as clearance is obtained. Thank you for your patience." Sophia sighed. She had a stacked schedule in Denver meetings with airline executives, a keynote at a safety seminar, and a surprise inspection. But for now, she was just another passenger stuck in line, waiting. She could only hope the delay wouldn't ruin her entire day. Little did she know, the bigger disruption was about to come from that flight attendant. She'd just noticed a man whose own stress and biases would collide with her hidden authority in ways that neither of them could predict. Dante roamed the gate area, checking in with passengers to manage the rising tension caused by the delay. His approach had always been to greet travelers with a friendly smile, but this morning he felt off balance, a nagging irritability simmering just beneath the surface. Perhaps it was lack of sleep, Perhaps it was the frustration of dealing with another mechanical delay that he had no control over. Regardless, his usual bright demeanor was missing. Some of the regular business travelers recognized him, and he managed brief pleasantries. Yet whenever his eyes strayed to Sophia Alexander, that uneasy feeling returned. He caught himself wondering, who is she? Why is she so calm while everyone else is restless? It was a strange question, but something about her composed posture made him feel threatened somehow. His internal monologue wrestled with half-formed reasons to justify his growing suspicion. She was carrying herself more like a person used to giving orders than receiving them. Perhaps she was an air marshal or a corporate executive. The flight attendant in him felt a compulsion to confirm that her presence was, in fact, routine. Dante tried to shrug it off. He had legitimate responsibilities, verifying the head count, ensuring the manifest matched the passenger list, and coordinating with the gate agent about reboarding times. Addison, the gate agent, flagged him over. They're saying it's just a minor software reset, she explained. We might start boarding again in 15 minutes if it checks out. All right. Thanks for the update, he replied, forcing a smile. He then turned to address a cluster of passengers who looked particularly frustrated. They peppered him with questions he didn't fully have answers to, so he gave them standard airline reassurance. We appreciate your patience. Safety is our priority, and we'll board as soon as we can. But once that group dispersed, he found his gaze drifting back to Sophia. She hadn't approached the counter to complain, nor had she asked any questions. She seemed almost too self-contained, which paradoxically made him more suspicious. He began to feel that intangible prickle on the back of his neck, the same feeling he sometimes got during training drills when an instructor was about to test him on a hidden scenario. Letting his curiosity get the best of him, Dante walked toward her. "Ma'am," he said politely. "Is everything all right? Are you aware we're slightly delayed?" Sophia looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "Yes, I heard the announcements. I'm perfectly fine waiting. Thank you for checking." Something in her tone or her direct gaze made him flinch internally. It wasn't rude, not at all. It was just authoritative. "Of course," he said, clearing his throat, "just making sure everyone's informed." She nodded, a faint, polite smile on her lips, and resumed scrolling through her phone. Dante lingered a moment, then turned away, feeling a swirl of unease. His mind latched onto an irrational narrative. Maybe she's filming us or preparing to lodge a complaint. Or something else. He'd seen it happen before, an unassuming passenger turning out to be an inspector or a journalist eager to expose any airline misstep. Suddenly, a wave of embarrassment washed over him. "I'm being paranoid," he chided himself. Yet the seeds of distrust had already been planted. The tension that morning was fueling it, and he failed to quell the baseless suspicion growing in his mind. He straightened his uniform jacket, glancing at Sophia one more time before stepping back onto the jet bridge to finalize pre-flight checks. If only he knew just how close his paranoid hunch was to the actual truth, and how it would soon explode into public confrontation. 15 minutes later, maintenance cleared the aircraft for departure. Addison's voice came over the speakers, now adopting a relieved tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are ready to begin boarding flight 237 to Denver. Please line up in your designated zones." Passengers quickly formed a new line. Some wore expressions of visible relief, while others still bristled from the inconvenience. Sophia joined the queue when her group number was called, silently noting the calm efficiency of the gate agents. As the line advanced, she sensed a commotion near the front. Standing at the entrance to the jet bridge, Dante was scanning boarding passes as Addison handled final seat assignments. He nodded at each passenger, occasionally cracking a polite joke to lighten the mood. But when Sophia reached him, his composure faltered. A look of heightened alertness flashed across his face. "Ma'am, "Can I see your boarding pass?" he asked, though Addison was the one scanning everyone else's passes. Sophia extended her paper boarding pass without question, along with her valid ID. He scrutinized it far longer than he had for any other traveler. "And your ID again, please." She blinked, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "Sure," she said, handing it over. "Is there an issue?" Dante studied her driver's license, then looked at the boarding pass, then at her face. It was standard procedure to confirm identity, but the intensity in his gaze signaled something else. He leaned closer to Addison, murmuring in her ear. Addison frowned slightly, returning the items to Sophia with an apologetic look. "Everything seems fine," Addison said, clearly trying to move the line along. The father behind Sophia jostled with his toddler, looking impatient, but Dante didn't hand the documents back yet. He hesitated, shifting his stance. "Could you step aside for a moment, please?" Sophia's eyes narrowed. Her tone remained polite, but she couldn't hide her confusion. "Is there a specific reason?" Dante's voice took on a clipped edge. "I just need to verify something." At this point, Addison looked visibly uncomfortable. "Dante, we have to keep boarding." "It's okay, Addison. Please let me handle this," he interrupted, a note of stubborn authority creeping into his voice. Sophia felt the weight of curious stares from other passengers. She was used to occasional extra scrutiny, but there was something about Dante's manner that felt off. Reluctantly, she followed him a few steps away from the line. He handed her back her boarding pass and ID. "You're traveling alone?" he asked, as though that were unusual. "Yes," she replied calmly. "I'm on a business trip." He exhaled, then said in a lower voice, "I might have to ask you to wait for the next flight. We need to ensure everything is correct with your documentation." A wave of shock and annoyance passed through Sophia. Wait for the next flight? She'd never been asked to do that, unless a flight was fully booked or she'd arrived late. "My documentation is correct," she stated evenly. "Is there a problem with my seat?" Dante looked momentarily trapped. "No, it's not that. Excuse me." Addison had come up behind him, alarmed. "We can't remove a passenger for no valid reason. Her seat is confirmed." But Dante held firm, tension radiating through his posture. "I'm concerned about potential security concerns," he said, his voice carrying enough volume that a few bystanders overheard. Sophia felt anger rise in her chest. She had dedicated her career to aviation safety, yet here she was, publicly singled out with no legitimate cause. She drew a calming breath, remembering her own protocols. "Don't escalate. Stay calm, gather information." She locked eyes with Dante. "I'm not a security concern. If you truly believe otherwise, you can call airport security for verification. But I have every right to board this flight." Passengers in the line started whispering, glancing at them. Addison looked on the verge of panic, torn between her co-worker's stance and the passenger's obvious legitimacy. This was quickly becoming an unnecessary spectacle. None of them knew that the real bombshell was about to drop and that it would shatter Dante's illusion of authority in one swift blow. Addison quietly signaled to a nearby supervisor, hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated further. The supervisor, a seasoned ground staff member named Rosa, hurried over. She had worked at Hartsfield-Jackson for nearly 2 decades and recognized trouble when she saw it. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" Rosa asked Sophia gently, casting a wary glance at Dante. Sophia carefully measured her words. "I'm being told I might have to wait for the next flight, despite having a valid ticket and ID. I was also singled out without any clear reason," Dante interjected. "I have a responsibility to ensure the safety of everyone on board. I'm not comfortable letting her on until I can confirm some details." A line of passengers was backing up, some craning their necks to see what the fuss was about. Others tapped their feet impatiently, anxious to board. Rosa sighed, stepping closer to Dante. "What details are you trying to confirm?" she asked in a hushed tone, conscious of the growing audience. Dante's voice wavered. I can't say. There's just something off." Rosa's eyebrows rose. She'd dealt with these situations before, where a staff member's gut feeling morphed into an overreach. "Dante, unless you have a legitimate security issue, we have to proceed. We're going to miss our takeoff slot." Sophia decided it was time to make her position clear. She pulled a slim black wallet from her tote. Inside it, among credit cards and IDs, was her FAA credential. With measured calm, she presented it to Rosa. "I'm Sophia Alexander, Chief Regulator for the Federal Aviation Administration. I have every right to be on this flight. And I don't appreciate being treated as a security concern without any basis." Rosa's eyes widened, flickering between the official badge and Sophia's face. "Oh, Miss Alexander, the first, so sorry for this inconvenience." Her gaze darted to Dante, her expression a silent question. "What have you done?" A buzz of confusion and surprise rippled through the onlookers as Rosa lowered her voice to address Sophia again. "Please accept our apologies, Miss Alexander." "Of course, you're welcome to board right away." Dante's face went ashen, a mixture of shock and dawning regret contorting his features. The realization that he'd tried to remove a high-ranking FAA official from the flight for no justifiable reason hit him like a physical blow. He'd known something was up, but not this. Sophia turned to him, her tone cool but resolute. "I understand that safety is your priority. It's mine too. But you singled me out and tried to remove me without any evidence or explanation. That's not standard procedure. And I assure you I know standard procedure very well." Passengers began murmuring more loudly. Some stepped away, wanting to distance themselves from the unfolding spectacle. The father with the toddler gave a concerned glance at Sophia, as if to say, "I'm sorry you went through that." For Dante, the weight of his mistake was crushing. He'd let his unexamined biases twist a mundane situation into a fiasco publicly, no less. And now, the woman he had antagonized was not just any traveler, but the FAA's Chief Regulator. With the boarding clock ticking, he stood there, heart pounding, as Rosa gently urged Miss Alexander to proceed onto the aircraft. The line resumed movement. Dante remained rooted to the spot, a dull roar echoing in his ears. He realized that the consequences of this misstep would be far greater than just an awkward moment at the gate. The real fallout was only beginning. Sophia boarded the plane, her mind awash in conflicting emotions. Anger, disappointment, and a hint of sadness intermingled. She had worked so hard to ensure airline regulations fostered both security and fairness. Yet here, she was targeted by someone who should have known better. Is this what everyday passengers go through? She wondered, reminding herself that not everyone possessed a special credential to produce in the face of unjust scrutiny. Inside the aircraft, the early bird passengers already seated looked up with mild curiosity. Sophia found her assigned seat in first class, one of the few perks she occasionally allowed herself on these business trips. She placed her tote under the seat and exhaled, trying to regain composure. A flurry of activity at the front signaled more passengers boarding. Flight attendants hustled about, stowing luggage and offering pre-flight beverages. Meanwhile, Dante was nowhere in sight. It was Addison and two other cabin crew members who oversaw the remainder of the boarding process. Sophia guessed that Dante was dealing with the shock of what had just happened, or possibly conferring with his supervisors. As the last of the passengers took their seats, Addison approached Sophia with an apologetic smile. "Miss Alexander, on behalf of Delta, I want to apologize again for the inconvenience at the gate. Please let me know if you need anything." Sophia acknowledged the gesture with a polite nod. "Thank you. I appreciate your kindness." I'm sure you all have procedures to follow, but it's important that everyone on your team understands the proper lines. Addison lowered her gaze, clearly embarrassed. I understand. I'm sorry for the trouble. Shortly after, the captain's voice crackled over the par. Ladies and gentlemen, we've completed maintenance checks and are cleared for departure. Our flight time to Denver will be approximately 2 hours and 45 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare for takeoff. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane pushed back from the gate. Sophia fastened her seatbelt, mentally preparing for the flight ahead. She had to shift her focus. There was a regulatory conference waiting for her in Denver after all. But her mind drifted back to Dante's expression, that mix of defensiveness and fear. She wondered what kind of ripple effects the incident might have on his career. Just before takeoff, a brief flicker of movement caught her eye. Dante stepped into the first-class cabin, scanning the seats as if to confirm everyone was buckled in. When his gaze landed on Sophia, he hesitated. She met his eyes, offered a slight, neutral nod, no hostility, just acknowledgement. He paled, quickly turning away to finish his duties. Sophia closed her eyes as the plane roared down the runway. This was not a situation she had asked for, yet it had become her reality. If Dante's behavior stemmed from personal biases, her duty as a regulator and as a human being was to address it. But the question of how still lingered. Did she file a formal complaint? Did she let the airline handle it internally? For the moment, she put those thoughts on hold, focusing on the safety briefing playing out in the cabin. If there was one thing she believed in wholeheartedly, it was the necessity of a secure and just aviation system. As the wheels lifted off the tarmac, she resolved to deal with Dante properly once she had all the facts and a calm mind. An hour into the flight, the fasten seatbelt sign dinged off, and the cabin settled into a gentle hum. Passengers flipped open laptops, rummaged through carry-ons, or dozed against the windows. Sophia sipped a glass of water, scanning through emails on her tablet. She half listened to the murmur of conversation from the row behind her, where two business travelers swapped stories about delayed flights and corporate deals. Though she was occupied with work, her awareness lingered on the presence of Dante and the potential tension that might still simmer. She caught glimpses of him moving up and down the aisle, handing out drinks and snacks. Despite the mask of normalcy, she could sense his unease. Finally, Addison approached Sophia again, her brow slightly furrowed. "Miss Alexander, I hate to bother you," she said, softly, but Dante asked if he could speak to you privately after the service round. "Would you be open to that?" Sophia raised an eyebrow. She set down her tablet and considered. Part of her was irritated by the request. Why should she placate him after his unfair treatment? But the other part recognized that confrontation could lead to understanding, especially if Dante was genuinely remorseful or seeking clarity. "All right," she agreed. "I can spare a few minutes." Addison looked relieved. "Thank you. I'll let him know." About 20 minutes later, as other flight attendants cleared away trays, Dante hovered near the curtain that separated first class from the galley. He signaled to Sophia that he was ready. She unbuckled her seatbelt and followed him a short distance toward a narrow alcove. The space was tight, just enough room for them to speak without disturbing other passengers. Dante's posture radiated nervousness. His usual confident stance had crumbled, replaced by uncertainty. "Miss Alexander," he began in a hushed tone, "I want to apologize for what happened at the gate." She inclined her head, keeping her voice neutral. "I appreciate that, but I'd like to understand what led you to single me out." He swallowed, glancing down at his polished shoes before meeting her gaze. There was something about how calm you were, how in control. I got suspicious, like maybe you were scoping the flight or something." Sophia arched an eyebrow. "Because I wasn't complaining about the delay?" He flushed. "I know it sounds ridiculous now, But I've been with Delta for 5 years, and I've seen situations where someone seemed too collected, and it turned out they were an air marshal or a journalist about to expose something. I guess I let my paranoia get the best of me. She studied his face, searching for sincerity. And do you often remove suspicious passengers? He shook his head vehemently. No, but I was worried. 1. I overreacted. And then I doubled down, which was a huge mistake. Sophia exhaled slowly. She was glad to hear a mea culpa, but an itch of frustration lingered. You should be aware that your gut feeling can be colored by personal biases. Do you realize how humiliating it is for someone to be pulled aside without legitimate cause, especially for a passenger of color? Dante's eyes flickered with guilt. I understand that now. Look, I'm not a racist. I've never... She held up a hand. I'm not labeling you. I'm telling you that behavior like yours can come across as discriminatory. As an FAA regulator, my job is to ensure safety protocols are followed fairly and responsibly. I hope you see why this is serious. Dante nodded, eyes misting. I do. I'm truly sorry. Silence stretched between them in the cramped alcove. Finally, Sophia nodded. I accept your apology. But this isn't just about me. It's about how you treat any passenger. I trust Delta will handle the matter internally, but I also have a responsibility to report what happened. A muscle in Dante's jaw tightened. He swallowed again. I understand, he whispered. With that, Sophia returned to her seat, her heart still hammering from the intensity of the exchange. She couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility pressing on her. This wasn't just about one flight attendant's error. It represented a systemic issue she had pledged to address in her role at the FAA. The real turbulence, it seemed, was yet to come. The flight to Denver eventually smoothed into a routine journey after Sophia and Dante's conversation. The aircraft landed on time, despite the initial delay. Passengers disembarked, relieved to be at their destination, while the flight crew stood by, offering the usual thank you for flying with us. Dante attempted a polite farewell to Sophia, but she merely nodded and walked on, her thoughts already forming the basis of a formal incident note in her head. Her next few days in Denver were a whirlwind. She attended a major airline safety conference, delivered a keynote speech, and had back-to-back meetings with airline executives. However, the encounter with Dante remained lodged in her mind. She recognized that it exemplified the delicate line between vigilance and bias. If an experienced flight attendant could make such a glaring error, how many other micro or macro aggressions happen daily in airports nationwide? On the third day in Denver, she received a call from an FAA colleague, Janine West. Hey, Sophia, I heard you had an incident with a Delta flight attendant in Atlanta. Words traveled fast. Sophia inhaled, leaning back in her hotel chair. Yes, it was. Unfortunate. I'm planning to file an internal report soon. Have you heard anything else? Janine hesitated. There's some chatter that Delta management's already aware of it. They might be launching their own review, especially since it involves you. A twinge of relief ran through Sophia. That's good. Accountability is important. What are your next steps? Janine asked. Sophia pinched the bridge of her nose, fatigue pressing in. I'll submit the formal complaint outlining the events. Beyond that, I'm not out for blood. I just want to make sure this triggers better training and awareness, especially about how biases can manifest. Janine agreed. You've always been fair-minded, Sophia. All right, keep me posted. This might blow up in the news if someone recorded a video at the gate, but hopefully it'll stay in-house. After hanging up, Sophia gazed at the skyline view from her hotel window. She couldn't help wondering about Dante's fate. She wasn't vindictive, but the harsh truth was that consequences followed these kinds of incidents, particularly when they involve a high-level official. Back in Atlanta, Delta's internal wheels of discipline and protocol were indeed spinning. Rosa's supervisor had filed an incident report the moment the plane took off, describing how Dante attempted to remove a paying passenger without clear cause. By the time Dante's plane landed in Denver, an email from management awaited him, requesting his presence for a performance review meeting upon his return. At home that evening, Dante tried to unwind, but the tension gnawed at him. His phone buzzed with texts from a few co-workers who'd caught wind of the fiasco. "What happened, man?" one message read. Another said, "Heard you confronted an FAA big shot." He sighed, wishing he could vanish into the couch cushions. He recalled his conversation with Sophia in the tight alcove. She had been firm, but not cruel. He knew she had the power to demand his termination if she chose. Yet, ironically, the sense of her fundamental fairness made his guilt sting worse. He realized that whatever came next would be a harsh lesson in personal accountability. For Sophia, the next few days would be filled with drafting her statement, responding to media inquiries if they arose, and balancing her ongoing duties. For Dante, it meant grappling with the anxiety of not knowing whether he would still have a job in a week. Both had set foot on a collision course at Gate B-27, and the reverberations now spanned from Denver conference rooms to Atlanta corporate offices. A simple act of bias had unleashed consequences neither had fully foreseen. Once Sophia returned to her Washington, D.C., office, the headquarters, where she oversaw various FAA committees, she immediately filed an internal report. The document outlined the sequence of events, the delay, the boarding process, Dante's unwarranted request that she step aside, and his attempt to remove her from the flight. It also included a copy of her ticket, boarding pass, and any relevant time stamps or gate information she could recall. Her language was measured, but unequivocal about the fact that the incident constituted a serious lapse in protocol. Simultaneously, Delta Airlines' corporate HR opened its own investigation. They interviewed Addison, Rosa, and the gate staff who witnessed the fiasco, collecting testimonies that largely corroborated Sophia's account. They requested a meeting with Dante, giving him a chance to explain his side. Shaken but resolute, Dante arrived at Delta's corporate office in Atlanta a week later. He sat in a sterile conference room with grey carpeting and a single potted plant in the corner. The table was large enough for 10 people, but only 3 were present. Dante, an HR representative named Clark, and a stern-faced manager from in-flight services named Caroline. Caroline wasted no time. "Mr. Ramirez, we've reviewed the preliminary findings. Can you explain why you attempted to remove Miss Alexander, an FAA official, from a flight without following the proper escalation procedures?" Dante swallowed, his palms damp. I genuinely believed there might be a security concern." She appeared unusually calm, and given the delay and my past experiences, I overreacted. I admit I had no concrete reason, no suspicious behavior, no discrepancy in her documents. Clark leaned forward. "You do realize that removing or threatening to remove a passenger without valid cause not only violates Delta policy, but could also be construed as discrimination." "I know," Dante said, his voice trembling. "It wasn't discrimination on purpose, but I understand how it looks, especially because Miss Alexander is a black woman. I made a grave mistake." Caroline tapped a pen against a file, her gaze unyielding. "We can't ignore the possibility of racial bias, implicit or otherwise. The FAA has already flagged this as a serious incident. You could have placed Delta in legal jeopardy." His heart pounded in his chest. "I understand. I'm truly sorry. I take full responsibility." A tense silence filled the room. Clark exchanged a look with Caroline. Delta had built its public image on inclusive values and customer care, so having an FAA official singled out by a flight attendant was a scandal in the making. They needed to show accountability. Finally, Caroline spoke. "We're placing you on unpaid suspension for 4 weeks. You will also undergo mandatory sensitivity and anti-bias training. After that, your position will be evaluated. This is the most lenient option, given the seriousness of the incident. A repeat offense will result in immediate termination." Though the news hit him like a punch to the gut, Dante felt a wave of relief that he wasn't outright fired. "Thank you for giving me another chance," he said, voice quavering. The meeting ended without further pleasantries. Dante left the building with a stack of compliance documents in hand, weighed down by shame and a flicker of gratitude for a second chance. Across the country, Sophia received an email from Delta's executive office confirming that disciplinary action had been taken and promising further staff training. She nodded to herself, hoping that this was more than mere damage control, that it might catalyze real change. Yet the story was not over. Both Dante and Sophia would soon find themselves in a public spotlight neither of them anticipated, as word of the incident began to leak into the broader aviation community. A few days after Dante's suspension was announced internally, a travel blogger picked up whispers of the controversy. The blogger specialized in exposing stories where airline employees crossed ethical lines. Armed with partial information, they published a sensational headline: "Delta flight attendant tries to kick FAA official off-plane racial profiling alleged." The story went viral within hours. Aviation forums lit up with discussions, debates, and angry commentary. Some people demanded Dante's immediate termination. Others questioned whether the FAA official had used her power to intimidate airline staff. As is common in internet debates, facts were twisted and speculations ran rampant. Sophia learned of the article when a friend texted her a link. Scrolling through the sensationalized content, she felt a mix of dismay and anger. She had never intended for this to become a public spectacle. "I just wanted the airline to address its protocols and staff biases," she thought. Now, the entire incident was a trending topic on social media. She braced herself for potential reporters or paparazzi showing up at FAA headquarters. Meanwhile, Dante faced an onslaught of hate messages on his personal social media accounts. Strangers called him racist, incompetent, and far worse. Some even issued threats. The digital maelstrom only deepened his guilt. He had indeed made a grave error, but the entire world labeling him irredeemable was a weight too heavy to bear. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from family members, ex-colleagues, and even old friends. The shame was suffocating. During his suspension, Dante tried to make productive use of his mandated training. The materials he read forced him to confront how implicit bias can manifest, especially under stress. He attended a workshop where people of diverse backgrounds shared personal stories of discrimination in travel. Listening to them stirred a deep sense of empathy and remorse. For the first time, he truly understood how microaggressions, or even a mere suspicious glare, could cut someone deeply. While Dante wrestled with this personal reckoning, Delta Airlines scrambled to control the narrative. A senior vice president issued a public apology, reaffirming the company's commitment to diversity and inclusion. They also mentioned that the flight attendant in question had been disciplined and would undergo additional training, but the press release did little to quell the uproar. The FAA, under public pressure, released a brief statement confirming that Sophia Alexander had been subjected to an inappropriate attempt to remove her from a flight. They withheld details, citing an ongoing internal review, but their words confirmed the blogger's story, that it was indeed a case of improper conduct. For Sophia, hard karma meant being thrust into a media spotlight she never sought. Her work inbox flooded with requests for comment from newspapers and TV stations. Some implied she'd orchestrated the scandal to push a personal agenda, while others lauded her for standing up against discrimination. The complexity of it all weighed heavily on her. She cared about aviation safety and fairness, not about fueling sensational headlines. For Dante, hard karma arrived in the form of a public shaming he couldn't escape, combined with the very real possibility that he might never escape the label of the racist flight attendant. He recognized he had inflicted harm and that accountability was necessary, but he also dreaded that his single worst moment might define him forever. Yet, sometimes, karma also paves a path to redemption if one is willing to walk it with humility and effort. The question remained, would Dante truly learn and rebuild, and would Sophia ever find a way to step out of the media frenzy to focus on her mission at the FAA? As the media storm churned on, Sophia tried to keep her daily life intact. She focused on upcoming safety regulations that needed her review and continued traveling for site inspections. But no matter where she went, the incident followed her. She'd arrive at an airport for official business, only to see people whispering, pointing, or asking if she was that FAA official from the Delta scandal. One afternoon, she received a personal email from Dante. It had taken him days to work up the courage to write it. The subject line was simple: apology and request. Dear Miss Alexander, I hope you're well. I know you don't owe me anything, but I wanted to thank you for accepting my apology on the plane that day and for not pushing to have me immediately fired. The last few weeks have been a harsh lesson. I'm suspended, going through training, and reflecting deeply on my mistakes. I also wanted to say that I'm sorry for the public circus this has become. I never intended for any of this to happen, but I realize my ignorance played a role. If it's possible, I'd like to speak to you in a calmer setting to really understand how my actions came across and what I can do to make amends. Sincerely, Dante Ramirez. Sophia stared at the email for several minutes. She could have ignored it. She was under no obligation to counsel him or ease his guilt. But something about his earnest tone made her consider it. If her role was to ensure a fair and just aviation system, perhaps part of that meant helping individuals grow, not just punishing them. She typed out a measured reply, stating she was open to a brief phone call when her schedule allowed. Learning from our mistakes is essential, she wrote, and I'm willing to help you do that. A few days later, they spoke by phone. Dante's voice quivered with nerves. He thanked her repeatedly for even taking his call. He asked how he could better identify and mitigate the biases that led him to single her out. Sophia described the training module she'd seen work well in other airlines and how crucial it was to question gut instincts that might be rooted in prejudice rather than real threats. Listening to him wrestle with regret, Sophia felt her own tension ease. She realized that, in some small way, her confrontation with Dante was forcing meaningful change for him, at least. Perhaps, if handled properly, it could spark broader reforms within his airline. By the end of the call, Dante seemed both humbled and hopeful. Thank you, he said softly. I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm determined to do better, and maybe, over time, I can show you and every passenger that I've changed. Sophia ended the call, thinking about how personal accountability and institutional policy must work hand in hand. She wouldn't forget the humiliation of that day at Gate 27, but maybe they could both transform a painful incident into something constructive. In a system as massive as commercial aviation, real change often begins with individual choices and revelations. Months passed, and the Delta flight attendant versus FAA official story gradually faded from the public consciousness, replaced by new headlines. Yet the effects of that day reverberated in tangible ways. Delta instituted more rigorous bias awareness training for all cabin crew, not just those flagged for incidents. Internal memos stressed the importance of strictly following standard operating procedures when questioning a passenger's right to fly. The message was clear: missteps born of prejudice wouldn't be tolerated. Dante completed his suspension and returned to work under a probationary status. He was assigned fewer long-haul flights initially and was closely monitored by supervisors. Though some colleagues treated him awkwardly, he also found unexpected support. Addison, Rosa, and a few others who had witnessed the meltdown at the gate rallied around him, offering words of encouragement. He took their kindness as motivation to prove he was capable of growth. In the meantime, Sophia continued her role as FAA's Chief Regulator, advancing reforms that pushed for not just safer flights, but fairer treatment of all passengers. Every time she signed off on a new policy or revised an old one, she recalled the personal sting of being singled out. That experience fueled her determination to ensure that no passenger, regardless of race or background, would face such an ordeal. Eventually, a quiet opportunity for face-to-face closure arose. Sophia was scheduled for another flight from Atlanta, this time to Seattle, for a high-level meeting with airline CEOs. By chance, Dante was assigned to the same flight, though neither of them knew it in advance. The day of the trip, Sophia boarded as usual, ignoring the sidelong glances from a few staff members who recognized her name on the passenger list. Partway through the flight, Dante mustered the courage to approach her seat. He stood at a polite distance, addressing her softly, "Miss Alexander, may I get you anything?" It was a simple gesture, but it carried layers of meaning. She looked up, recognition dawning. A small smile crossed her face, free of animosity. "Just some water. Thank you," she said. He returned moments later with a cup of water. There was no grand apology, no dramatic public scene, just a respectful, genuine moment between two people who had been on opposite sides of a painful incident. With a nod, he offered the drink. She thanked him and sipped it quietly, the tension that once defined their interaction having dissipated into an unspoken understanding. By the time the plane landed, the two shared a final acknowledgement, a subtle, mutual respect. In that moment, they both sensed that a lesson had been learned and a chapter was closing. Neither was naive enough to think the airline industry's challenges or racial biases had vanished, but they had each played a role in one tangible change, proving that personal growth and institutional reform can indeed go hand in hand. As Sophia rolled her luggage off the plane and into the terminal, she felt a serene sense of resolution. Yes, the journey had been turbulent, but in the realm of aviation and life, sometimes the roughest flights lead us to the most necessary destinations. Thank you for following this intense journey where a flight attendant's unfounded suspicions clashed head-on with the quiet authority of the FAA's Chief Regulator. Dante's hard lesson shows us how destructive assumptions can be, especially when reinforced by stress and bias. Meanwhile, Sophia's measured response reminds us that change can emerge from confrontation if we're willing to use adversity as a catalyst for progress. In the end, this isn't just about one airline or one person. It's a snapshot of issues that impact travelers around the world. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that spark conversation, highlight important social themes, and inspire personal growth. Let's keep the dialogue going, and together we can foster a world where understanding triumphs over prejudice. Safe travels, everyone.